Hey everybody, Rachel Willis and Jim Donnelly, technical agronomist in Northern Illinois for DEKALB and Asgrow. We're coming here again with another agronomy update for you. We have several topics that we want to talk about. Again, the biggest one that I think we're going to talk about is weather related. You'll probably see a theme. A lot of the stuff that we discuss is weather related. Jim's territory is still a little bit on the dry side. My territory has tracked a little bit wetter than his. The other thing that we're going to talk about is corn rootworm hatch, where, believe it or not, we're getting enough GDUs to where we need to start talking about that. And then we also are going to talk a little bit about white mold and using a fungicide to control white mold at R1. As we think about the next 2 weeks, we could start to see some flowers on beans, believe it or not, or at least be to the point where we need to be thinking about flowering and have a plan if our weather is cool and wet. So Jim, let's kick it off with a little bit of weather discussion. So, like I said, your territory is still tracked a little bit drier than mine. What are you seeing? What concerns do you have because of that?
Yeah, so outside of some initial emergence concerns, I think we kind of got over that hump. We had, for the most part, just enough rainfall to kind of get those laggers coming. So stands are okay, but the biggest thing to watch out for is especially the furthest north and especially northeast. As you get close to that northeast corner of Illinois, it's been really, really dry, and we'll throw up an image here, but basically 25-50-ish% of normal for the last 30 to 60 days. And that's usually good for planting conditions, but if we don't start getting some rainfall here, things are going to catch up with us a little bit. So a couple things that I guess I have thought about when looking at some of these dry conditions. One that we've already seen has been some herbicide carryover, especially in corn. So you think about it, we're utilizing more modes of action, different chemistries in soybeans, just because we're dealing with more glyphosate resistant weeds all the time, i.e. water hemp. And so we're using quite a bit more active ingredients, specifically products like fomeciphin. That particular product, active ingredient, is known to cause some carryover issues, especially when planted late when sprayed late the previous year, but also in drier conditions where you have a dry fall, winter, dry spring. We're more prone to get those carryover situations. So we've already seen that where we had maybe not necessarily a very late application, but it was just very dry since those applications were made all the way back from fall even through spring. So those are things that we really want to pay attention to, is some of the herbicide carryover stuff. The other thing that I want the growers and dealers to be looking at is whenever we get these dry conditions early, we'll start to see a fair amount of potassium deficiency in both crops, but especially corn right now. The uptake of potassium is pretty rapid right now. And one thing about potassium availability in dry conditions is that availability goes down. And when we have those conditions, even when we're maybe marginal on potassium, we think we're okay, but we're not super low. Even in those areas, we can start to see a decrease in potassium availability. The symptoms that we look for potassium availability in corn or potassium deficiency is really the margins around the outside of the lower leaves will turn yellow slash oranges. Sometimes it'll take on a little orangish color. And again, those will be the lowest most leaves, the oldest most leaves. And it'll tend to follow, some soil type differences or areas that are just lower in potassium levels. So those are things that we really need to watch out for. I guarantee that it's going to show up if it doesn't start raining here soon, and we're going to get a fair amount of calls. Just briefly, the reason why we see more potassium deficiency is when we get dry weather, those potassium molecules tend to get trapped within the clay particles, so it becomes much more difficult for that plant to access potassium. And when you're in those marginal levels, then it becomes harder. So those are just a couple things that I look at kind of coming down the pike with this dry weather stuff.
Yeah. So one other thing we talked about, Jim, that I think both of us have experienced, but you more, there's been a little bit more frost. I'm kind of sick of talking about frost.
Yeah,
It's June now.
I think we decided we weren't going to talk about it because we were so tired of it, but
yeah. So I was just going to quickly say that if people are still experiencing frost, we can go back and look at previous videos. There's several resources. Cold weather related that we haven't really seen quite as much as that silver leaf on corn.
Yep.
I've seen a little bit of that in my territory, basically cosmetic, nothing that I'm too worked up over, except that I wish it would quit getting cold. It's June now, so other than that, nothing.
The calendar has turned June, it's time to move on.
Exactly, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, there's a fair amount of that out there. I would say every field in northern Illinois, at least in my area, has some degree of that. Even some yellowing, just from what I would call sublethal freeze injury. You know, it just looks putrid, and then you add that silver color. Yeah, it's not pretty. It needs to warm up.
It does, yeah. So in my territory, you know, we have a lot of that ugly corn as well that you talked about. Like I said, a little bit of the silver leaf, some of the kind of yellowing from corn or from cold. And then it's also been a little bit wetter in my territory. So in the last update that we did, we talked a little bit about nitrogen. You might need to add a little bit more nitrogen where it was really saturated there. The other thing that I'm starting to see, because I think we've been a little bit wetter than your territory, is some seedling disease. So I've walked a couple fields that have a little bit of pythium. I generally think of pythium as being favored by cool and wet. There are species that can be favored by slightly warmer temperatures. We certainly had both, but there for a good chunk of the last month, we had some cool and wet temperatures.
Yep.
So I'm not super shocked to see a little bit of pythium there. You know, if you are seeing your stand start to go backwards, where there's obviously like little dead corn carcasses out there, keep an eye on that. Make sure that you know, that you're aware of how much you have out there, so you aren't losing too much stand. You know, you can do things like work on drainage, which is an agronomic recommendation we make for a lot of problems that is really difficult to follow, and I realize that. But you know, I think that cool and wet period that we had in my territory really just favored some of that pythium development. The good news is a lot of my corn's getting tall, and as it gets a little bit taller, I think it's gonna become less susceptible. And like I said, you know, fingers crossed, we warm up here and we'll be a little better off.
Yeah, you think about where you're at for a growth stage down there, I would assume that most of it, outside of the very late planted stuff, most of it is getting into that stage where it can kind of fend for itself and not relying on the seed, right?
Yes. So I think that we have a lot of that's close to that V3 stage where we're really starting to get a little bit more vigorous plant there. So again, it's just kind of a be patient, keep an eye on those fields where you know you have a history of pythium, but for the most part, I think that we're close to getting a little bit to a safer spot.
Yeah. Well, and I'd say this is another great example of you can have the pathogen, but you really need that environment to really cause issues, because my territory is pretty well known for having a decent amount of pythium, and this year we've hardly seen any. And you know, God knows we've got plenty of inoculum out there. We just didn't have the environment for it. So, I mean, I'm thankful we're not dealing with it. But
yeah, and I don't think that it's a widespread problem in my territory. We probably don't have as much inoculum as you, but we did have a nice environmental condition to give us a little bit in spots.
Sure.
Yeah. So. Anything else you want to add on weather? I mean, I think our next topic of rootworm kind of ties into weather, because we're going to talk a little bit about temperatures. But
I guess I would add something with regards to weather. I think one thing that both of our territories should probably watch for is something called rapid growth syndrome. So just kind of looking forward in the next couple of weeks. Rapid growth syndrome is favored by periods of slow growth, and then transitioning into periods of very rapid growth. So very warm conditions where you're accumulating a lot of growing degree days. this is exactly that. So we've gone from frost to, you know, highs approaching 90 or reaching 90. This will be a perfect environment for that. So I guess be prepared for those symptoms where you get, basically the corn is growing faster than it can keep up with, and you get those whorls ended up being very tightly wrapped and having a hard time pushing through itself. Eventually it'll come through. There's really no yield concerns behind it, but it certainly will show up and get some questions, because as that actually is able to push through, you'll end up having these leaves stick out that are very yellow, very pale, and it'll be random plants throughout the field, and we'll get questions. What is that? Is that the refuge? You know, things like that. You know, that's simply just rapid growth syndrome that all those plants will pull through, and you're just seeing the results of it at that time. So tends to be a little more hybrid specific. You'll have some hybrids that do that a little bit more than others, but we've got the perfect environment for it, and I would anticipate seeing that at least at some level throughout our territories.
Yeah, that's a good call out. If we get our wish for nice warm weather now, we'll probably see it.
Bring it on.
Yeah, so let's talk about rootworm. You looked up a little bit of information, because like you said, it feels a little odd to already be talking about rootworm hatch and getting to R1 in beans, but we're, you know, the next couple weeks we're going to get there. So tell me what you found on those numbers.
It seems like it's taken forever to get to V4, V5, but from a rootworm hatch standpoint, usually for Northern Illinois, we're looking around that, you know, first week of June. Sometimes it's been late May, but around that first week of June is generally when we kind of start to see those first hatches for rootworm larvae. Just from a GDU standpoint, I looked up a few different locations, kind of the same locations that you use for regular growing degree days. And these are accumulated starting on January 1st. But at Peoria, we were at 460 GDUs there. Typically 11-year average is 482. Big Bend is 563 with 11-year average of 520, so a little bit ahead of schedule. And Freeport is 465 with 11-year average of 403, so also ahead of schedule there. To give you a little bit of context, we anticipate about 50% egg hatch, somewhere in the range of 684 to 767. And you know, if you go back through those locations, we're running anywhere from 460 to 560. So really, I would say any time we're probably going to get some of the first little hatch, and probably would expect 50% hatch, and well, depending on what this forecast does, in a week to 10 days. So, you know, we're right there from a rootworm hatch standpoint.
So, and that's based on soil temperature, correct?
Those are based on soil temperature GDUs.
Yeah.
That's the right way to do it.
Yeah, so I was looking a little bit at our GDUs, and you know, there is some similarity there, but there's a little bit of a difference. So I wanted to make sure to call out that was based on soil temperature, which is where the eggs are, which is
exactly
why we do it that way. Yeah.
The other thing to think about is a lot of times we'll look for things in the environment that kind of help us figure out if the rootworm egg hatch is on us. And obviously one that a lot of people know about is lightning bug appearance. So the lightning bug appearance tends to coincide pretty well with rootworm hatch. And one reason that it tends to coincide pretty well is when you think about it, the development of the lightning bugs is actually in the ground too. So it's subject to the same GDU accumulation or lack thereof as rootworm in the ground as well. So that's why that one is a pretty good bioindicator for rootworm as well. So
how long before we can go float some larvae?
Good question. Usually when it's first hatching, it's pretty hard to find unless, you know, you're really buried down in the bucket, you know. I would honestly say if you wanted to look really hard, you could probably find some in 10 days for sure.
Okay. So
I wouldn't be surprised Peoria, you know, if you look really hard, you can find some in a week, but you really got to be looking hard.
So maybe next update or the one after, we can find some larvae afloat.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll watch it.
You'll let me go take
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Sounds
Did
good.
a great job, Rachel.
Yeah.
So, transitioning from rootworm, do you have anything else to add?
No.
I guess I will say that conditions, unfortunately, from a hatch standpoint, at least for my geography, you know, north of 80 is actually, unfortunately, pretty good. We had a mild winter. I think we talked about this before. We had a mild winter, and right now, north of 80 is pretty dry. You know, that's good for rootworm. You know, I don't think we're going to drown any. So, you know, producers in that area should really be watching, especially their long-term corn rotations. What do you feel like down south? I know it's hard to predict bug pressure, but is it wet enough, do you think, in some areas?
I mean, I think that we've really dried off in a lot of spots.
Okay.
I don't think that we're really saturated. So unfortunately, we dealt with a whole bunch of rain, but probably not at the time to drown those rootworm. So
Gotcha.
I would also be watching those hot pockets where you know that you've had historical pressure where you have corn on corn.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, moving on from rootworm, we wanted to touch a little bit on white mold with potential flowering dates, first flowering dates coming up. So just from a white mold management standpoint, I guess what would you recommend, and what do you see from a management standpoint going forward that farmers and dealers should be implementing?
Yeah, so some of the strategies to manage white mold we can't do anything about right now in season. Things like wider rows, dropping your population a little bit. We talked a little bit about soybean population. You can get away with fewer beans out there to really allow for more airflow in that canopy. Obviously, we're mostly done planting. We can't change those decisions right now. So one of the things that we have, the best tool that we have right now is a fungicide application at R1. So we generally say fungicide application at R3. That's the one that, for foliar diseases, that's the one that pays off. But when we're very specifically targeting white mold, you are trying to prevent the infection of that flower. So when the soybean starts to flower, it's very vulnerable to infection. So that fungicide helps out. Really, it's kind of a tough decision if you know that you've had a history of white mold. If you have a variety that's a little more susceptible to white mold, that makes it a little bit easier to decide to do that R1 application. But a lot of it comes back to weather. I said that we're gonna, all this whole time we're gonna talk about weather and just keep referencing it. But white mold, deciding to do that R1 application really comes back to, has it been pretty cool and wet right when it starts to flower? Those conditions are gonna be more conducive to infection. So if we're 90 degrees and dry, up in Jim's territory, might not be as big of a deal, but you also have a more established history of white mold.
Sure.
So you kind of got to weigh those two out there.
Yeah. And the other thing to think about is that we don't have anything as far as a canopy right now. We had a lot of bare dirt, and 90 degrees and dry weather and bare dirt doesn't tend to bode very well for white mold, thankfully.
Yeah, you guys might be in a better spot there. But I would certainly go out and look at check those fields where you see if you are at canopy, those fields that you have a history of white mold. Unfortunately, rotation doesn't do a whole lot for white mold. Those sclerotia can really survive for, I think I've read 10 years, but I'm not really sure if they know exactly how long.
It's a long time.
Long enough that you're not, rotation isn't going to help you much there. So, really thinking about field history, thinking about weather, thinking about what you actually have out there as far as a canopy. Those are the three things. The other reason that we're talking a little bit about this now, usually we think of June, the third week of June, starting to see flowers. As you plant your beans earlier, we've actually seen a little bit of a shift in flowering to slightly earlier. So that's why we're talking about it now, because we want you to be thinking about it a little, a week ahead of when you normally would.
Mm-hmm.
So here in a week or two, in your early planted beans, you may see some flowers just a little bit before you would expect them to be out.
Yep, that's a good point.
So I'll put up a picture here. We did, some of my counterparts in Iowa did some research on Delaro Complete, an R1 followed by an R3, and then an untreated, to really show, collect some yield data, but also show a visual difference. You can really see very nicely on those susceptible varieties. There was a huge difference when using that R1 and that R1 plus R3 fungicide application. So right now, because we've already made all of our other management decisions, your fungicide is really your best bet in those, if we have a cool, wet environment.
But you would still suggest, so that R3 application, that's, year in and year out, that's where we get our biggest bang for our buck. That's probably something that growers and dealers should still consider regardless, right?
Right, yeah. So I think of, when I started like 10 years ago, we talked about an R3 fungicide insecticide application as high management, and now it almost feels like it's somewhat standard management. And so I would still keep that practice in there, especially prices are high.
Yeah.
We have very good yield potential in some spots in my territory. So that R3 is still there. You still need to really consider that one hard, especially a fungicide plus insecticide at R3. But when you have that pressure, the additional R1 will really help you with the white mold. We know that without controlling that white mold, it can be pretty devastating if you have really good conditions for it.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
All right, anything else on the white mold?
I don't think so.
So why don't you give us a regular growing degree day update and just kind of let us know where we're at.
Alrighty. So we'll start south. Peoria, it's at 577. It's actually 20 degrees ahead of normal. It's usually 557, so they really warmed up there. Big Bend is at 545. It's usually 559, so a little bit of a discrepancy there. DEKALB is at 519 right now. They are traditionally 495, so they're a little bit ahead. They've kind of tracked ahead this whole time. And then Freeport, again, it's at 522, and it's usually 459. So
quite a bit ahead.
Yeah, up north, that's kind of what we've seen this whole time, is that the north is way ahead. You're still hot and dry up there, I guess. So.
The winter.
Well, I hope that you guys catch some rain here soon. So.
Yeah, we'll see. Doesn't look very favorable. We'll at least get the heat.
Yeah. So, anything else that you want to add, Jim?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of them.
Okay, well, thanks for watching, guys. As always, if you have questions on some of the topics we called, or if you have suggestions for topics next time, please give us a call.
Thanks, everyone.